It brings me great pleasure and it's an honor to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Miss Ashley Futrell. She is our invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Annual Distinguished Speaker as part of our Language of Diversity lecture series. Several weeks ago when I asked her if she would be willing to speak and in honor of Dr. King's legacy, she immediately said yes. And this is before she knew the topic, the time, the date, the scope of the audience, or the size. And I was reminded of something a colleague recently told me at the start of the year, that during uncertain times and challenging times, leaders lead. She simply said yes, and she steps up tonight to speak as we honor the legacy of Dr. King. She shows us that leadership is not uh, doing what others can't do, it's doing what others won't do. This is the second time that she's spoken in this past year to the College of Medicine, so she's family now. The first was last year as part of a panel addressing social justice in the midst of a pandemic. And that was my first encounter hearing Ms. Futrell speak. One of the most striking things I noticed during that talk was that after Ms. Futrell spoke, there was always a pause because no one seemed to want to follow her. And understandably so, she is a powerful speaker. And thankfully tonight she has the opportunity to share all by herself her talk on the topic of more than a white coat, healing the well-being of a nation as we seek to better serve the community around us. Ms. Futrell is one of Toledo's rising stars. She is one of our best and brightest. She graduated from American University with her BA in Law and Society, an MA from Johns Hopkins University, and received her JD from Howard University School of Law. She is an established litigator and counselor. She's a former assistant U.S. attorney in the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Ohio, where she investigated and prosecuted federal crimes, including public corruption. She began her law career as an assistant DA in the Manhattan DA's office, where she investigated and prosecuted all phases of misdemeanor and federal felony cases and represented New York County in criminal hearings and trials. Before law school, she served as a senior staff member on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., where she advised several members of Congress on a wide variety of legislative issues. Ms. Futrell is also a leader in this Toledo community. In 2019, she was the recipient of Toledo's 20 Under 40 Leadership Recognition Award. She serves on the board of directors for the Toledo Bar Association, the Toledo Opera, Leadership Toledo, and the Toledo Alliance for the Performing Arts. She epitomizes excellence in leadership, scholarship, and service, and it is an honor to hear her speak to our College of Medicine family tonight. Please join me in offering her a warm welcome. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Ashley Futrell.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, Dr. Jenkins?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Jenkins and the University of Toledo College of Medicine and Life Sciences Office of Diversity and Inclusion for inviting me to speak to you today. And thank you to the distinguished faculty, staff, students, and guests for attending. I'm delighted to be here today. As Dr. Jenkins noted, last year I spoke in a panel called Navigating Social Injustices Amidst a Pandemic, which served as my introduction to the UT College of Medicine and Life Sciences Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I'm excited about the work that you do, the incredible careers that the medical students will have, and the enormous impact that you will have on our society. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about tonight. I appreciate the department's commitment to training a diverse group of well-rounded medical students. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. may have said it best when he said, "Life's most urgent question is, what are you doing for others?" Whether we are doctors, lawyers, nurses, pharmacists, or paralegals, we all have a purpose. And that purpose is to find a way to help others by using our talents and abilities. I truly believe that there is an assignment for all of us, and that it's up to each of us to water that seed that's within us, to make a difference in our country and to heal our nation. I was born and raised right here in Toledo. After graduating from high school, I moved to Washington, D.C. to attend college. While there, I worked with members of Congress on Capitol Hill, handling a variety of different policy matters, including healthcare issues. 7 years later, I attended Howard University School of Law and earned my law degree. And it was there that I learned a quote by Charles Hamilton Houston, one of the architects of Brown versus Board of Education. He said that a lawyer is either a parasite on society or a social engineer. I was told that a social engineer is a person who uses the Constitution to help their community. And at that moment, my mission was clear. I wanted to be that social engineer and use my background to help other people. Since law school, I've worked in government as a state prosecutor, where I had the chance to impact change case by case, by not stereotyping defendants, and by working to achieve the best outcome for the case. Now in private practice, I work in employment law and litigation, and my work allows me to educate companies and organizations about preventing and correcting workplace harassment and discrimination. I feel lucky to have the opportunity to affect change and make a difference in my profession and in my community. You too are in a unique position to affect change in your current and in your future roles. Our world was turned upside down last year with the emergence of COVID-19 and on May 25th, 2020, when a police officer knelt on an unarmed Black man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Prior to May 25th, all the headlines were about COVID-19. But then the majority of Americans woke up and were face to face with police brutality. But the incident with George Floyd wasn't new. It had happened for years. Tamir Rice, Laquan McDonald, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor. Last year was not the first time that we witnessed similar events. And there were protests. But because they were protesting the actions of police, those protesters were dismissed and disregarded when they were simply advocating for their right to breathe. But many of us felt hopeless. We felt helpless. We were in the middle of an enormous health pandemic, and the world was on fire. Many of us asked, how can I help? What can I do? How can law students and lawyers help? How can medical students and doctors have an impact on the social justice movement? But even in the midst of a pandemic and a large-scale racial divide that occurred in our country, health disparities plagued our country. Many of you understand that social causes are intimately connected to practicing medicine. You know better than I do that social determinants greatly influence quality of life and can result in human suffering. We experience growth health inequities across our country. COVID-19 is an excellent example of the divide that exists in medicine. Even before COVID-19, health inequities and structural racism contributed to higher rates of strokes, high blood pressure, and risk factors such as diabetes and hypertension. Furthermore, discrimination in housing, education, and other areas impacts mental health in minorities, and the communities in which minorities live are often affected by environmental toxins, food deserts, and toxins in water. But what can medical practitioners do to impact social justice? There are 3 areas to which you can contribute. First, you can contribute by spotting the social action issues around you. Health inequities exist and divide our country every day. You know the stats better than I do, from infant mortality to rates of diabetes and lead poisoning to high rates of kidney failure in minorities. Health disparities are glaring. Even Serena Williams could have become a statistic when she almost died during childbirth. Black doctors and medical students, you may have already heard this come up in your families and in your communities, but one of the concerns that your patients may want to share with you is fear and anxiety surrounding the COVID-19 vaccines. For example, many members of the Black community are apprehensive about taking the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines. But instead of judging this fear, you can acknowledge it and understand that it stems from a distrust in medical experiments by the government, including the exploitation of African bodies. And to my white colleagues, if you are not already aware, you will likely learn that this distrust has been held in many Black families for generations. In fact, Dr. James Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, experimented on enslaved African women without their consent and without anesthesia in the 1840s. Many of you are aware of the 40-year Tuskegee experiment in which the government invited Black men to take part in a study under the false pretense of receiving free healthcare. The government withheld the fact that they were actually suffering from syphilis, and they gave these victims placebos and ineffective treatments and procedures in place of real, effective medical care. These fears of exploitation are rooted in real stories and experiences. So acknowledge that fear when working with your Black patients, many of whom are nervous about doctors and medical professionals. What's more, the interaction between a doctor and a patient can be plagued by bias. A 2016 study found that Black people are less likely than white people to receive sufficient treatment for pain. Recently, I learned about a Black woman being treated for COVID-19 in a suburban Indianapolis hospital. Her white doctor downplayed her complaints of pain, told her that he felt uncomfortable giving her more narcotics, and suggested that she be discharged. She said she was crushed and felt as though her doctor treated her like a drug dealer. After complaining about her treatment that she received, she said that it adequately treated her pain. She was eventually sent home, but more than 2 weeks after posting a video about her encounter, the patient died of complications from COVID-19. Her name was Dr. Moore. That's right. She was a Black medical doctor, a family physician. Dr. Moore's story speaks to the bias that still exists in our nation's medical profession. Dr. Moore's education could not convince her doctors that they should listen to her. And her white coat couldn't protect her from mistreatment in hospitals. Every time she went to a hospital, she had to advocate for herself and fight to get adequate care. This last time in particular, she didn't feel well enough to be discharged and sent home. But that's where you come in. Second, you can contribute by identifying your role in the social justice movement. You can be the medical professional who is alert, aware, and in tune with the impact that bias, with the implicit bias that often prevents patients, like Dr. Moore, from receiving the care that they need. You have a role in this movement. You can check your practice routinely to make sure all patients and practitioners are treated fairly. Women physicians and physicians of color are often degraded. There have been cases in which ER doctors had to fight against flight attendants who questioned their medical credentials as they gave emergency treatment to patients on airplanes, and cases of women doctors who were asked while interviewing for fellowships if they plan to have children. You can help stop this by being the kind of medical professional who takes a stand when you see these kinds of injustices occur. And to be clear, this is a social justice movement, and you are needed now more than ever to heal the well-being of this nation. We need you to use your gifts to impact your patients. Each of us has a skill, a gift, or ability that can be used to help others. Although you should be proud to be a doctor, it's bigger than that. You would be selling yourself short if you did not think about your career as more than a white coat. As a healthcare professional, you have a duty to look out for your patients. They trust you. They tell you their issues, large and small. But in exchange for this trust, they need your respect. They need your voice. They need you to listen to them, to believe them, and to validate them. You can bring valuable insight into the healthcare arena. You are listened to. So take advantage of that. And as you think about your role in the social justice movement, consider what you can do to make a difference and show up authentically in your community. To be clear, everyone will not have the same role in the social justice movement. There are agitators, advocates, and protesters. There are also researchers, doctors, lawyers, nurses, and professors. See, we can all have a role in ridding our society of the inequities that exist. And today, we're talking about the medical profession. But tomorrow, we could be talking about the criminal justice system, the education system, or the financial sector. Please work hard to ensure that medicine is a force for good. So as you work to have an impact on the social justice movement, never, ever stop learning. Look, I can only imagine how tough it is to be a medical student or part of the medical profession. After law school, I never wanted to take another class. But what I found is that whether you are listening to a podcast on a topic in your industry, writing articles, taking advanced courses, or talking to mentors in your field, being a life learner is essential to keeping up with what's going on in our world so that you can help your patients and society. Growing up, I would always do my homework at my grandparents' house after school while my mother worked. I was always reading something or talking. One day, while I was doing my homework, my grandfather poked his head in the room where I was studying. He smiled at me and said, "Keep your head in the books." "Okay, Grandpa," I said, and I just kept on studying. A few hours later, after helping someone fix a flat tire, my grandfather passed away from an aneurysm. It completely shook me. And to this day, I have always kept my grandfather's final words close to my heart. I think about those words when I don't want to study. I think about those words when I don't want to go to training. Keep your head in the books. So I encourage you today to keep your head in the books. Read articles about the social justice movement and what's going on in our world, and challenge your beliefs and your biases. Remember that medicine, like law, is always changing. So stay up to date on current trends and research and other topics in your field so that you can show up in your community. But before you can show up and take your place in the social justice movement as a medical practitioner, you have to get your mind right. You cannot play small. Everywhere you turn, you may stand face to face with your insecurities, and you will not always be affirmed in professional environments. Imposter syndrome is real, and it affects many of us. But you must tell yourself that you are worthy and you are valuable, even when you make mistakes. As Dr. King said, as long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. Psychological freedom, a firm sense of self-esteem, is the most powerful weapon against a long night of physical slavery. Lastly, you can contribute by taking action to improve society's issues. There are many ways that you can use your voice to make a difference. In fact, many of you, I'm sure, are doing it already. When I moved back to Toledo from New York City, I was overwhelmed by how many opportunities there are to serve in Toledo. As professionals in the medical field, people will see you as a leader. You will be able to contribute your ideas to a variety of topics. And this advice is not just for Black medical professionals. Allyship is important and needed in this social justice movement. A trend exists in which patients refuse to be treated by doctors of color, women doctors, or younger looking doctors. You can create policies in your office that support these doctors so that patients cannot refuse to be treated by a doctor based on that doctor's identity. You can also join a board, mentor a young person, and create opportunities in neighborhoods of color. You can work with community leaders to build trails, playgrounds, and parks, and take part in other activities that bridge the gap between minorities and the medical profession. You can also be a philanthropist and donate money to organizations that are making a positive difference in your community. The Toledo Opera is a great example of a community organization that seeks to improve society's social justice issues. Many people view the art form of opera as white and elitist. So who would have expected the Toledo Opera to take a stand about George Floyd? They also consistently engage community members of color to ensure their performances, performers, and audience members are treated fairly and with respect. They bring people of color to the table for community events and to work to make the Toledo Opera accessible for all people. So if the Toledo Opera can establish their place in the social justice movement, then each of you can do the same in your lane. See, it's not enough to just be nice or kind to people. We must educate our children and colleagues. We can't sit idly by and be a neutral. We must recognize that while everyone holds biases, it's up to each of us to work on ourselves. It's also important to realize that many of us benefit from institutional and systematic racism, no matter how kind or nice we are. We must exhibit the courage to call out things for what they are in our industries and confront bias, racism, and injustice in the medical practice and in our society. One day, you may serve in leadership roles in a hospital, practice, or other medical facility. When you do, be aware of how you treat minority applicants. Consider whether your institution can adequately retain minorities. Is it a safe space? What do your staff members talk about when they are not working? Consider any biases you may have and whether they enter the conversation. You would be surprised how many microaggressions exist, those comments and behaviors that are grounded in biases, racism, or stereotypes. These completely undermine a Black applicant's ability to perform effectively during an interview or after they are hired. Consider bringing in a professional who can analyze your office or department and who can look under the hood to discover opportunities for improvement in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the best ways you can take action is by becoming an advocate. Many organizations need people just like you to advocate for state and federal legislation that affects the medical community and impacts health disparities. From the National Medical Association to White Coats for Black Lives, a movement for racial justice and medicine. Using your voice to advocate for your community is not only helpful, but it's necessary. When I worked on Capitol Hill as a staffer, I saw the value of having medical professionals come to DC and tell us what affects their industry. It's extremely compelling, and you can make the case for why these issues matter. And trust me, you will be listened to. So as I close, I want to remind you that you can do more than just wear a white coat. You can do more than protest. You can be more than what you are today. Society has real issues, and you can help fix them. Your profession provides the credibility and opportunity for you to make a difference by spotting the social justice issues that exist, identifying your role in the social justice movement, and taking action to impact the social justice movement, you can find your voice and your lane in this important fight. Because, as Dr. King said, we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I invite you to stay in touch with me, especially as you move on in your careers and within your profession. And at this time, I will turn it back over to Dr. Jenkins, and I will answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Ms. Futrell, thank you so much. You have been both inspiring and motivational to everyone, I think, here on the line tonight. We can open this up to questions for you. But I did have a question. You mentioned allyship. What does that mean to be a good ally in your view? What does it mean, especially if you're not of minority background and you're interested in reaching out and committing yourself to underserved and marginalized communities?
That's a great question. I mean, allyship has so many forms. I'll just give you a few examples of what I believe that allyship is. First, it's doing the homework. It's doing the work to figure out what's going on, as I mentioned, in our community. You know, there is a trend that exists out there where there are some people who are not minorities who are expecting their minority colleagues to answer all of their questions. And I will tell you that one thing to consider is that your minority colleagues and friends, we're tired, we're exhausted, because we constantly see the effects on TV and on our social media profiles, and we're always constantly reminded of the injustices that exist. So I would definitely encourage you, if you want to be an ally, do the research, put in the time to read books, to read articles, and to educate yourselves on what's going on in our country and what you can do about it. Another thing that you can do, especially in your profession, is you can sponsor a person. And what I mean by that is you can look at the minorities that may be in your industry and you can say, what can I do to make sure that they're listened to, that their ideas are respected, and to make sure that they have all the tools necessary to be successful. Another thing that you can do is constantly, educate yourself by going to events and talking to thought leaders and trying to figure out, what is my niche? Where can I contribute the most? So for example, many of you may have special skills. Maybe your skill is grant writing, or maybe your skill is, you're someone that talks to youth and loves to interact with schools. Well, figure out a way where you can show up authentically by doing something that's unique to you in order to impact the social justice movement. And Dr. Jenkins, there's so many ways that an ally can be helpful, but I think those are some ways to just kind of get things started. And I mentioned two organizations already within my speech, the National Medical Association and White Coats for Black Lives. Look at those organizations and so many others. And also, if there's an organization that does not exist, you can always create it. You are empowered to do that. And as I said before, you'll be listened to because people respect you and they respect your profession.
Has a new chapter even this past year here, real vibrant and robust and active membership. What are some of the other non-traditional ways that medical students and students in the healthcare professions can get involved?
Well, I mentioned this earlier, but I want to talk a little bit more about advocacy. So as I mentioned before, I worked on Capitol Hill, and the most beneficial thing you can do is to advocate to your lawmakers and the thought leaders in your community. And what I mean by that is I know that this isn't traditionally what a medical student has done before, but what you can do is find out who are your local elected officials, who are your state leaders, who are your federal representatives, and figure out how can I make an impact? How can I find out who may be connected to them? Should I write a letter? Maybe you want to write a letter and have your colleagues sign on in order to advocate for or against a piece of legislation that impacts the medical profession. Another thing you could do is you could talk to other coalitions of other groups that are working on these issues in our community. I know the YWCA is really taken the lead and doing incredible things in our community when it comes to social justice issues. You can be at that table and really, give that expert advice on what's going on in the medical profession and what the statistics are. Because it's one thing for me to say it, but if it comes from you, someone who has credibility in this industry, again, you will be listened to. So I think that advocacy would be a non-traditional way that I would approach this. Because again, if you get the ear of a thought leader and they hear from you about health disparities and what they can do, that will be effective. The one other thing I'll say about advocacy is you want to go in with a strategy in mind. You want to have a piece of legislation or a question or an ask that you think that this thought leader can help you solve. That's going to be important because that thought leader will turn around and ask you, what do you want me to do? And you want to have an answer. And there are plenty of resources in town, including myself, who can help you to figure out, how to make the case for the type of change that you want to see in our community.
Excellent, excellent. You did kind of mention confronting bias that you may encounter in the workplace or in our students' case in the classroom. Have you had experiences where you've had to confront bias? Most individuals fear the repercussions of confronting bias that's inflicted on a colleague or a classmate or someone else, even when they know that they're facing wrongdoing. They just worry about the consequences personally. Have you had that experience in all of these different circles that you've had in Manhattan, DC, I'm sure, all across the country?
Absolutely. I will give you an example. When I was a state prosecutor, one of the issues that often came up was this idea of what do we do with our cases? What do we do with a defendant who's been accused of a crime? And one of the things that I always tried to do is I tried to be thoughtful and I tried to be smart about prosecution. So sometimes I would recommend a particular sentence that was an alternative to incarceration, which basically means it wasn't incarceration, but it was something else. It was another method, whether it was a program, whether it was a community service or some other alternative to incarceration. And obviously this depends on the type of crime that occurred. But there are times when you're judged for that. There were times when I was told, that I'm being soft on crime or that, I just don't get it. But in time, as I stay in the profession longer, then I'll understand. But I think you have to be strong in those environments. You have to understand that in doing the right thing, there are people who will oppose you and who will have different opinions. And being able to be respectful, but to be able to stand firm in your beliefs is very important. Also, and I mentioned this earlier when I talked to you about getting your mind right. What I mean by that is you have to be able to stand in your truth, and you have to understand that you got to be able to understand that everyone and everything is not for you, and there's a lot of strength in being able to find your people and to find the environment that best suits you. Now look, I get it. Having a good job, we went to professional school, many of us, and you went to medical school, I went to law school, and we want jobs and positions within our profession. However, we also have to recognize when there may be psychological or honestly physical effects that may not necessarily be healthy that affect us because of it. And we have to be able to find those folks that are, within our professions that are supportive. We have to find mentors. And, it would be great if a mentor was assigned to each of us, but unfortunately that doesn't always happen. So we have to be proactive, utilize our resources, and even the network that we may not even know exists. So for example, one of the things that I constantly do is I go on LinkedIn and I meet people who are doing the things that I want to do. And oftentimes I will just send them a message. And you'd be surprised how many times they respond and they're willing to give me advice and feedback. So just always remembering who you are and remembering what your skills and abilities are. And that, as I said before, there's a seed inside of you and a purpose for your life. That's going to help you to be able to stand in your truth when you confront those biases, but also understanding that that job or that position that you're in, that's not your final resting place. and that there are other opportunities that you will have as long as you put the work in as well to network and to talk to people and find out where would a safe space be for me in my profession.
You mentioned mentorship, and I'm a strong proponent and advocate for effective mentoring in professional and academic life. Can you give us some examples of strong mentorship in your life when you've been outside of your comfort zone? I know you're one of Toledo's own, but you were in New York City and Washington, D.C., all of these different spaces. Did you have a strong mentor?
I had so many mentors. First, Toledo has mentored me. I always say all roads lead back home, and that is definitely true. I mean, from just when I came to DC, when I went to DC after high school, I felt like a fish out of water. There were so many times where I felt like my colleagues around me just knew so much more about the way that the world worked. And I remember I was interested in working in politics and I wanted to work on Capitol Hill, but I didn't know anyone. I didn't have political connections in Washington, D.C. And that freshman year at American University, I remember coming back home to Toledo and actually going to a Toledo Mud Hens game. And when I was there, I met my stepdad's colleague and we just started talking, and I told him where I went to school and that I was interested in politics. And he told me that his sister worked for the United States Senate, and he gave me her information. And when I tell you, it felt like I had a golden ticket. I remember I took that business card, and when I went back to school, I contacted his sister immediately. And I remember going to the United States Senate, and this particular woman showed me around and she introduced me to her colleagues. And I remember at the end of that interview or that conversation, I remember that was the time when I needed to make an ask. And I was nervous, but I asked if I could come in just a couple times a week during the times when I didn't have class and just learn about the environment. And that woman served as a mentor to me because she helped me understand Capitol Hill and how it worked. But also, many of my mentors have honestly come from events like today, where you go to an event, you go to a panel, and you hear someone speak and you see something in them. And I will often reach out to that speaker or the presenter, introduce myself, explain to them where we met or where I heard them, and then I'll try to keep in touch. But also, I think it's important to really think about the fact that mentorship is not just professional. You can have mentors in all areas of your life. So you may have a mentor in your community, someone who you look to for advice and guidance on community service or community organizations. And you may have another mentor who is someone you look to for, if you're a religious person, religious guidance. And you may have, again, another mentor who helps you when it comes to your career. So I think it's important to recognize that everyone can be a mentor. Everyone, you can learn from everyone, but also, most importantly, people are looking at you. And when you think about that and realize that, I think that it really, it says something about the way that we live our lives. If we are always thinking that someone is watching, because growing up here in Toledo, I looked up to any of the lawyers that I saw, especially the Black lawyers and the Black women lawyers. There's a judge, Judge Armstrong, who was our first African American federal magistrate judge. And I remember doing a mock trial at the University of Toledo's summer law program that existed at that time when I was in high school. And we did a mock trial, and she was our judge. And to this day, I still talk to her. We text, we talk, and she's given me so much advice on my career. And again, that came from when I met her in high school. So that came from so many years ago. So that's what I would say in terms of mentorship. Just keep your eyes open, but also understand that you are a mentor as well.
And mentors have different roles in our lives. Like I can only imagine that when you've been in these unfamiliar spaces that you've had to confront and overcome your own personal fears and insecurities, whether personal or professional. How have you dealt with that? When you are a fish out of water, what would be some of your advice for how to understand, yes, this is a fearful environment and an uncertain situation. How can I deal with that and then still go about accomplishing my goals?
Absolutely. I have actually three tips for that. The first one is to recognize that you were put on this earth for a purpose, and that at this point, you're trying to find your life's work. I think Oprah Winfrey actually is the one that said, your life's work is to find your life's work. So if you are on the road to finding your life's work, that's not just finding a job. That's figuring out, what was I actually put here to do? So if you think about that, that will guide you, as you may have insecurities. But if you are walking in your purpose, that's going to help you overcome that insecurity, because you know that you're exactly where you're supposed to be. So have confidence in that. The second thing that I would say is that it's important to recognize, and I mentioned this earlier, that you are worthy, you are valuable, even when you make mistakes. As a first generation, I guess, graduate student and professional student, I will absolutely tell you that there are many times where many of us have felt insecurities. I mentioned the imposter syndrome earlier. That is absolutely a very real thing. However, if you tell yourself that everyone has been new, right? Everyone started on day one, and that you're going to make mistakes. I know that to even be where you are, you had to overcome so much, and you're incredibly accomplished and talented. But we all make mistakes. But when you make mistakes, just recognizing that you're still valuable, and no one else authorizes you, or no one basically says, you're good enough to be here. But you're the one that you have to say that to yourself. You can't go around expecting or waiting on somebody to validate you. You have to be the one to validate yourself. And third, I would just say that it's important to recognize who you are as a human being rather than who you are as a doer. That was a huge lesson that I learned in my career and in my life, more importantly, because what I realized is that I am Ashley Futrell, the human being, rather than Ashley Futrell, the fill in the blank, lawyer, whoever. And when you really think about the fact that your value comes in the fact that you are a human being, and because you were born and put it on this earth, then you will not be tilted and you will not waver when people are negative to you, or when people try to degrade you, or when someone says something that's insulting. Instead, you'll recognize and realize that my value does not come from my profession. It doesn't come from what I do. It comes from who I am. So I would just definitely say that those three pieces of information or advice has helped me in my journey. Every day is not easy, and trust me, in the law, I'm humbled every day. But recognizing who I am, and recognizing that I have a life's work and I'm here for a purpose, and that I am a human being that's worthy of value, dignity, and respect. Those are some of the things that truly helped me just to keep my mind right, as I said earlier.
Yeah, I really appreciate that too, because I think, especially when we're talking about social justice and some of our advocacy groups, there's going to be some failure, and there are going to be the inevitable obstacles that you confront. It's more of a marathon than a sprint. You don't just kind of get there. It's an ongoing journey as you're trying to get to kind of move the needle on social justice. And in closing, we're getting a little closer on time, but I just want to see if you have any examples of times professionally when you've had to face failure and then flip it around into something positive in your career.
Yes. So there have been many times. I always call myself a second time around kind of person, because sometimes it's difficult to get it right that first time. I'll give you a very real example. When I was in college, I knew that my life's calling, that my life's work was to be an advocate, but I needed a law degree to be the kind of advocate that I wanted to be, which was a lawyer. So I remember when I was in college, I thought that law school was just going to come easy. I thought that I was so involved in my school at American University, in my community, that these law schools were just going to love me and accept me into their schools, and the rest would be history. But oh, was I wrong. So there's this thing called the law school admissions test that many of you may know about or may have heard about. And it is a very difficult test and it tests you, and it's one of the important factors that a law school considers when looking at applicants, including your GPA. And my test scores were not very good. I didn't put the time in that I needed to get the score that would have allowed me to get into some of the schools that I wanted to go to for law school. But I remember taking the test and being so disappointed and thinking, I keep trying, I'm studying for this test and it's just not working. But also, I had to be real with myself and recognize that I didn't put the time in to study the way I needed to. And I knew I was capable of more. So I pivoted briefly. I worked on Capitol Hill after college. I went to Johns Hopkins University and earned a master's degree, but there was still that thing inside of me, that passion, that seed that knew that I had to eventually tackle this test again, this law school admissions test. So 7 years out of college, I signed up for a very good a prep course, excuse me. And I remember studying so hard for the LSAT. And just to be clear, it wasn't cute. It wasn't pretty. I would work all day, come home to my small apartment in Washington, D.C., and my hair would be a mess. I didn't care what I was wearing. I didn't care what I looked like. All I cared about was how many of those those questions that I could take and could answer correctly. That's what I cared about, was studying for that test. And I am happy to tell you that 7 years after college, after putting in the time that I knew I was capable of and that it deserved, my score went up 20 points. And all of a sudden now, I not only was able to get into law schools, but I had scholarships. And I was a completely different candidate after working for 7 years and studying and getting a higher LSAT score. I was a completely different candidate at that point. So that would absolutely be a time that I was humbled and that I had to just basically say, look, the door closed, but it's not all the way closed. I'm going to push it open. And also, just in terms of this fight for social justice, I just want to be very clear that there are times when it feels like we're taking one step forward and two steps back. There are so many instances where I may belong to an organization or I may have a conversation with someone and feel like I resonated with them and that they understand the fight. And then maybe their actions later or the organization's actions may not necessarily be in line with what we discussed. So there are always going to be those times where we think, even our country, that we're moving forward, and then something happens to remind us of where we are. But what I will tell you is, I adopt the optimism of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was an eternal optimist, but he was also a realist, and he always dreamed of a better world. He always dreamed of being able to get to a point. He always talked about going to the mountaintop. And I've seen the promised land. He looked over and saw the promised land. And I truly think that we can get there, but it's going to take work, and it's going to take all of us utilizing our skills and our abilities, as I mentioned, but also understanding that this is not an easy fight. It is discouraging at times. It is frustrating. We will be disappointed. We will be angry. But what can we do to turn that anger, that frustration, those fears, to turn that into something positive? And again, really show up authentically in our community so that we can keep moving the needle forward when it comes to social justice issues. And that's why I'm happy that I had the chance to talk to all of you today, because I know that each of you has a special skill and interest and ability that you can introduce and bring to the world in terms of the social justice movement. I just don't want anyone to think that they're not in this fight, because it's a fight that each of us is involved in. No one can just sit by and be neutral. There are many people who believe, and I'm one of them, that science is not neutral, that medicine is not neutral, that law is not neutral. And it's really, really important that we recognize that and we figure out, what can we do to move the needle forward, even when we are rejected, even when we are discouraged, even when we are upset and feel hopeless. What can we do? What investment can we bring to this movement to really make a difference?
Well said. As I said before from the panel from last year, there's always going to be a pause after Ms. Futrell speaks. And I really think that you've helped us take some of the frustration and challenges that we're facing internally and externally and kind of transform them into something positive tonight. I appreciate the time that you've taken. I appreciate you saying yes to the invitation. You're family now, so we will knocking on this door again. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot, and you are certainly one of Toledo's best and brightest, and a motivation for all of us to kind of work in and out of our lane towards social justice. So thank you so much for tonight, and thank you for everyone tonight joining us.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be here tonight, and I look forward to a long relationship with you. And please, again, contact me if you have any questions or if you want to keep the conversation going, because I dream of a wonderful and resourceful society where we can all make a difference and have an impact. So thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins, and thank you for everyone for attending tonight.